I'm Marjorie Woolacott, and I will be giving the first presentation this afternoon. And I want to say something about the theme of this year's SAND conference. Again, it's the mystery of being human. And it's one of the mysteries that I've been especially intrigued by in terms of the mystery of the transformation process as a human being when we have a mystical experience or a spiritual awakening. And before I begin my presentation, I also want you to think a little bit about that word transformation. What does the word transformation mean to you? And I'm going to give you my own short definition of transformation. For me, I believe in the case of spiritual awakenings, it's really a dynamic process that starts a seed change in the chemistry of our deepest part of our being, that then actually begins to help us understand that consciousness is fundamental, it's primary, it's eternal. And then that begins to play itself out in the rest of our life over time, and we begin to change our outer behavior as well. Also, when you look at the dictionary definition of transformation, you find something interesting. It says that actually transformation events in people's lives are very often disorienting at first. Disorienting, and I think you'll find that's the case in my own story of my transformation and also of another case that I'm going to be giving. So what I'm going to be doing during this presentation is I'm going to be exploring the characteristics of transcendent experiences that occur during near-death experiences and spiritual awakenings like cosmic consciousness, and also end-of-life transitions when we're truly moving toward the other side of the veil. And then I'm going to end with, being a neuroscientist, neurophysiological data on what it looks like is actually happening when we have a transcendent experience in terms of how it begins to actually transform us. So for those of you who haven't heard me speak before, let me just give you a little bit of background about myself. I am a neuroscientist, and that means I study behavior from what I call the third person or the scientific perspective. And I have written about 180 papers in the area of neuroscience, in brain development, in aging, and in neurologic disease. And I've received grants from the National Institutes of Health for from $500,000 to $1 million per grant for about 35 years, and written a textbook for clinicians on assessing and treating neurological patients that's in its 5th edition. But saying that, I was a scientific materialist when I started my research. And what that means, as you can see in the slide, is that my scientific view was this: our thoughts, our movements, and our awareness or our consciousness are solely a product of the activity of neurons in our brain. Then, in 1976, I began to meditate. And I had an experience in meditation that opened me up to an awareness of a dimension of reality that I had never before experienced. I was invited by my sister to a meditation retreat given by an Indian meditation master, Swami Muktananda. And though I was skeptical, someone says, yes. Though I was skeptical, since I was a materialist neuroscientist, I was curious and I decided to attend. Now, the first morning of the retreat, it was announced that during the meditation session, the Swami was going to walk around the room and initiate every individual there. Now, the scientist in me was skeptical. However, I was there for the weekend, so I decided to put the skepticism aside, and besides, I was curious to see what would happen. So when he reached me, I felt the Swami's thumb and fingers right between my eyes on the bridge of my nose. Now, I was alert. My eyes were closed, but otherwise my senses were fully engaged. So when I felt something that felt like a mini lightning bolt go from his fingers down into the center of my chest, I had a sense of utter certainty about the event. Now, I couldn't say what precisely was happening. To this day, I don't understand. But it felt like this current of electricity went from his fingers to my nose and down to the very center of my heart. I could feel the exact point where it stopped. I could feel then this energy radiating out from my heart that felt like pure love. It felt like pure nectar flowing through me and beyond me. And the words that came to mind had nothing to do with scientific analysis. They were, I'm home. I'm home. My heart is my home. Now, what was most amazing about that weekend was actually what happened afterwards. When I went back to my university position in Virginia, my world turned around 180 degrees without any effort or real willingness on my part. I suddenly got up the next morning at 5 a.m. spontaneously to meditate. I did this day after day after day, and in fact, it's never ceased. I did this knowing that just beneath the surface of my awareness simmered a quiet ecstasy. I tapped it once, and I knew it was there waiting for me. Now, going back to the slide, this created a shift in my worldview, and I had a professional dilemma. Is my world really Newtonian, as I thought it was, materialist, or is it energy-based? And in fact, I asked, what is consciousness? Is it tied to neural activity, or could consciousness actually exist without neurons? So now, even though I was meditating every morning, in my early years as a meditator, I was first and foremost a scientist. That experience had planted this new seed of understanding inside of me, but I didn't know how to integrate it into my life. Many of you might have experienced that at first yourselves. And it seemed like almost an impossible chasm existed between my life as a neuroscientist and my life as a meditator. Now, this dichotomy drove my husband crazy. We would go to a gathering with my friends who were neuroscientists at dinner, and he would start to talk about one of his favorite topics, which might be, for example, energy medicine or acupuncture, only to get a kick under the table from me, as I would politely help him change the subject because I was so worried about losing my credibility with my scientific colleagues. Now, after about 25 years of doing this, I felt a bit schizophrenic, leading these two absolutely separate lives. And it was a decision I made then to actually do something about it by beginning to do research in my own laboratory on meditation and on consciousness, including near-death experiences. So now what I want to do, to really have you think about, is how we could potentially conceive of this transformation process that I experienced, and I'll actually show have been shown in many other scientists' lives as well. And I want you to think about what is really going on with a spiritual awakening or a cosmic consciousness experience. So what you're going to see in this slide is actually a model I have of what might be happening to all of us. There's a transcendent experience in meditation, a near-death experience or cosmic consciousness, and in that moment, a seed is planted deep inside of our being, where we have this immediate change in our view of the world, and we believe, consciousness is fundamental. I know it is. And then, gradually, as you see in that top picture of the slide, that seed begins to actually sprout, and you see roots going down inside you to actually begin that transformation process internally. And then eventually it pops through the soil. And as you see, leaves begin to form. And I believe that's when we actually begin to see the changes in our behavior. And you often see people changing their entire career, or people integrating this experience to actually transform their career. For example, a doctor might become a very much more compassionate doctor as he works with his patients. So what I want to do next is actually explore the inquiry into this transformative process, looking at transcendent experiences of 94 scientists. And these data come from a website put together by Dr. Charlie Tart from the University of California, Davis. And it has now actually been taken over by an organization for which I am the president, which is called the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, the AAPS. And you can actually find all of the experiences that I will be talking about today, and specifically one I'll be talking about in a moment, on that website for the AAPS. Again, it is called the Archives of Scientists' Transcendent Experiences, or TASTE. So I think these experiences are interesting because scientists, as you know, are typically the most skeptical and materialistic of most human beings. Having been one, I can say that. And they really challenge their own belief in their own transcendent processes often and won't even believe that they happen. So what I'm going to do now is actually share with you the story of one of these scientists who had an experience of cosmic consciousness, which really changed his whole life. And his name is Dr. Alan Smith, and he was from the Bay Area. He was an MD, and he was also a materialist, and he worked as a researcher in anesthesiology at a local university. And he said, before that experience, I was not even interested in nor searching for any sort of transcendent or supernormal or supernatural experience. He said, I didn't even have an idea of what a mystical experience was. He says that his cosmic consciousness experience occurred when he was 38 years old, and it happened unexpectedly one evening when he was sitting at home by himself watching a particularly beautiful sunset. He said the sun was above the horizon and it was partially veiled by clouds. And he says the experience began with a mild tingling at the base of his spine. He then noticed that the level of the light in the room, as well as the sky outside, began to increase gradually. He then said, there's also a similar change in my behavior. And he said his mood began to go from feeling very good to feeling still better to feeling elated. While this was happening, he said the passage of time began to slow, became slower and slower, and eventually he said, only the present moment existed. He said, my elation proceeded to an ecstatic state, the intensity of which I had never imagined was possible. At this point, he says, I merged into the light, and everything, including myself, basically dissolved into one unified whole. So that experience of cosmic consciousness had a major impact on his life. He'd previously won a national prize for his research, and he had a grant that was funded for 5 years. But he said any interest in becoming a famous academician evaporated with that experience. He said he left his secure and successful university position, and he supported himself as a part-time freelance clinician, and later worked in medical ethics after getting a degree in consciousness studies. I think about that because in my own life, I waited a little while longer, but still that transformation process occurred. And so I asked myself, what happened to him in those moments of that transcendent experience? And as in my own experience, I believe that Dr. Smith became aware of this deeper level of reality, that consciousness truly was primary in that experience. And that really started the seed inside of him to begin to sprout and change his life, and then actually transform his career into something very different than he had before. I loved his understanding that his work seemed now simply like an interesting puzzle, but not a life-changing type of research that was going to change the whole world. Now he saw the world in a whole different way. So what I now want to do is actually show you some fascinating findings from all of the scientists that are actually listed on that website in terms of their experiences, so you can see really the stats in a certain sense on how these experiences change scientists' lives. So what you're looking at here is the effect of these transcendent experiences on these 94 people's lives. And on the right-hand part of the graph, you see people that have had experiences of a cosmic consciousness like Dr. Alan Smith. There were 36 of them that had an experience, that's the blue, and all of them, 36, transformed their worldview. That's the red line you see next to it. And 24 of those people actually changed their career or integrated that information into their career to really make their career much more aligned with this new viewpoint of the world. Now, there were only 6 of them that had near-death experiences, but of those, all of them changed their worldview, and 1/3 of them changed their career as a result of their near-death experience. And finally, if we look at out-of-body experiences and ESP or psi experiences like precognition, again, there were about 32 people that had those experiences. Less actually transformed their worldview, but it was the vast majority. And again, the majority actually changed their career or integrated this into their career. So to me, that is very interesting data because, again, scientists are some of the most difficult people to actually cause to change their worldview, and these experiences did that for them. So I want to quote now one scientist who was one of those that had the near-death experiences and what he said about that experience for himself. His name is John Wren Lewis. And again, you can find his data on the website. This is what he said about his NDE. He said, I went from an atheist and a skeptic of NDEs to a mystic. He says, the experience has remained with me ever since, not just as a changed attitude toward life, but he said, I now have a totally altered state of consciousness that is what I can only call an eternal quality right here and now. so that I no longer worry about what happens after death. So I think it's interesting to look at the similarities across these experiences of scientists with NDEs and other types of spiritual awakenings. And one of the things I can say about those similarities is that their subjective experiences, in fact, are very similar and include a sense of finding truths unplumbed by the intellect, light, and a sense of unity awareness and joy. But now I'm going to ask you, are these experiences also similar to end-of-life experiences? In other words, in people truly transitioning to the other side at the end of their lives. And I'm going to show you some interesting research recently done by a doctor who is in Switzerland, Monika Renz. So she is now looking at this experience of the end-of-life transition, and she has written articles in 2003 and 2018 looking at 80 cancer patients who are going through those stages of the dying process, those last stages. And I think what she actually has shown, which I will read for you if it's a little bit small, is she's seeing a transition process happening during this dying point in their life as a transformation of their perception. And she says it seems to go from an ego-centered perception, which we all have, probably many of us at least sitting in this room, I still have one myself, to what we might call an ego-distant perception, where we pull ourselves away from that desire for the ego to control everything. When they finally realize they're dying, the ego begins to give up. And she says she sees a pre-transition phase, a transition phase, and then a post-transition phase where there's a spiritual opening. And this happens in about 54% of the people that she actually studied in this process. In addition, 30% of the people actually struggled in that transition phase where the ego was wanting to keep control and finally realized it couldn't. And 46% of them actually also went through a life review. I thought that was fascinating. She also then did something else that was interesting. She looked at metaphors that they gave her and their family to describe this experience of the phases of letting go. So for example, in that transition phase where the ego is fighting and struggling, she notices some would talk about a horrible tunnel. And then afterwards, in post-transition, they would say, I can't find words for the light. Sometimes they would experience deafening noise or machines or what they experienced as hell in that transition phase. And then post-transition, they say, I'm hearing heavenly flutes. Sometimes she saw in terms of their behavior, they were frowning when the ego was struggling with all of this. And afterwards, they were experiencing awe and joy. Now here's one person's experience of that post-transition phase just before passing. His name was Eric, and he was in the final days of dying of cancer and had spent his life adhering to social conventions. And he said this to his wife. He said, I have never felt so free. He says it is as if a great weight, indeed even all family and social baggage, has been taken off of my shoulders. As if I only have to be Eric. Now I am just that. When I heard that, I thought, oh, I would love to be in that place. It's wonderful. So that's just one example of the many ways that transformation comes in the dying process. And Dr. Monika Renz says that there are some very beautiful variations on this theme. She says, for example, you see the process of dying is like a movement of us toward a mysterious apex. She says, nevertheless, we all die our own deaths. She says some become like a child, finding great trust beyond all fear. Others, she says, perhaps gestures all of their life, smile, amused at all the all-too-human events surrounding the deathbed. And she says, dying, they flit across to the other side quite unexpectedly, as if they're playing a last trick on their relatives. She also says that others actually die quietly and close to reality, stoically. And others experience a transcendence to uttermost truth and thus die as a sage or a mystic. And she says those of us gathered at the deathbed are left astonished, marveling at what the dying and the transition really is and what they teach us. She says we die as a child, a wise fool, a realist, or a mystic. So now in the final part of my talk, I'm going to step back into my role really as a neuroscientist and ask, what are the neural processes that actually accompany these mystical awakenings, these transitions in our lives? And I'm going to show you some physiological data about different states that occur where our brain activity is reduced, which seem to be associated with these mystical experiences, and which many, many scientists now are beginning to say are ways of allowing ourselves to actually access non-local consciousness. And I'm going to start with a slide that was actually given to me by Pim van Lommel, who does research on near-death experiences, looking at what happens to brain activity during cardiac arrest and flat EEG. So what you're seeing on the top slide is EEG and the ECG or EKG right underneath. And you see this person has a very normal cardiac rhythm in the beginning of the data being taken. And then at a certain point down the slide in B, you see the cardiac arrest begins to occur. Now notice that the EEG continues on for a while and all the way through this slide, but when we go to the next slide, you begin to see with the continued cardiac arrest that the EEG flatlines. So flatline means no activity at all in any of the cortex of the brain. The point is that at this particular point in time, the person is having a transcendent out-of-body experience, looking down on their body, seeing the resuscitation team working to actually revive them. And they may also be going to other realms. So Pim van Lommel's point is that if you think that neurons are creating your consciousness and your brain has flatlined and often remains flatlined for 2 or 3 or more minutes while you're watching the people trying to revive you, it doesn't seem that that materialist point of view actually holds up. So there's one example from near-death experiences of the brain activity being reduced to perhaps allow the person to experience non-local consciousness because the local filters on the brain are actually being eliminated. Now here's another one from meditation studies. So this is showing that thought-free meditation, where you're simply asking experienced meditators to go into a thought-free state, into deep meditation, and then associating that with mystical experiences that may come by that are in the laboratory, and they have an EEG cap recording EEG from all the areas of their brain. And what Hinterberger and his colleagues from Regensburg, Germany are looking at is this thought-free meditation compared to 3 other states: resting with your eyes closed, what he calls being present, presence monitoring, or focused attention. And what you're looking at here is brain levels of activity from the prefrontal cortex all the way down to the occipital lobe on the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, you're looking at the slowest brain waves, the delta waves, all the way through the highest brain waves, the gamma waves. And the blue lights or stripes with the dots in them, also looking a little bit black here in some places, are levels of reduced activity in all those parts of the brain and across those levels of different frequencies from slowest to highest in thought-free meditation compared to the other states. So he is saying that thought-free meditation reduces your brain activity, the amplitude of your brain activity across areas of the brain and across amplitudes of frequencies. Now, one more for you, and that is mystical states associated with psilocybin. And this is interesting work by Robin Carhart Harris and his colleagues in 2012, and they have a recent article as well, where they show once again that if you do a very carefully controlled experiment where you give persons psilocybin in one particular part of the experiment, and on another day you give them a placebo, and they don't know which day they're going to have placebo or psilocybin, but you then compare the brain activity in functional magnetic resonance imaging, what you discover is when they are on psilocybin, you see again, a reduction in all of the key hub areas of the brain. This is like the thalamus, the prefrontal cortex, the cingulate cortex, etc. And all of those blue areas then that you are seeing show this reduction, which is directly associated with the level of their mystical experience. In other words, the higher the mystical experience, the deeper the mystical experience, the more reduction in brain activity you get. So I now want to shift to say, can we actually create a model that might explain what is happening with these various mystical experiences? So what I have here is what I would call normal waking consciousness on the left side, and I say that there is a non-local consciousness which we potentially have access to in our lives. But in our normal waking state, we have a filter caused by the activity of our brain, which you see right here, and that then keeps us from really accessing this non-local consciousness, and instead we're confronted by the thoughts of our brain, our normal awareness. But when we experience a cosmic consciousness state or an NDE experience, what happens is that our brain activity, our mental activity goes way, way down, as you see on the far right-hand side, which allows then this cosmic experience of non-local awareness to actually come down into our own local awareness. And that's what that large green arrow really means. So I think that this is one way then of explaining what is really happening, is that our brain is really shutting down to allow this then to actually come through into our perception. So in ending, I want to say, I think what we've learned about this transformation that comes with NDEs or with meditative experiences of cosmic consciousness may actually have a way of actually giving us a doorway to cosmic consciousness. And often it starts, as I show on the right-hand side, with that seed being planted inside of our awareness that says consciousness is primary, a real experience, which then begins to transform our entire lives gradually over time. And I think more and more scientists are beginning to say that it looks like these transformative experiences actually are ways that can begin to change us inside out, doing this wonderful turning upside down of our lives in a very positive way. So we begin to actually integrate this in a whole new way into our careers. And in the dying process, this may actually happen a little bit more quickly in those last weeks of life, but again, it may be associated with the brain beginning to shut down and allowing these beautiful transformative experiences to come through. So I want to end by saying that a number of us who are scientists out there in the research world have actually begun to question whether materialism is actually the best way to view the world, and we are looking at a way of diving into the primacy of consciousness. And we have started a new academy called the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. And in this academy, what we're trying to do is to encourage young scientists, maybe some of you that are out there in the audience, to actually begin to work in this area, to look at consciousness being primary and do research in that area. And we're trying to support those people in any way we can in terms of getting tenure, in terms of getting grants, and to really foster your career blossoming. And I think that we're not trying to actually change the scientific worldview. We're simply trying to expand the worldview a little bit more to include consciousness within our scientific framework. I think in that way, we can actually help science move forward in a very positive way in our society. Thank you. And now I think we have about 5 minutes for questions if you have any questions. Yes?
Thank you. That was a very nice talk.
Thank you.
Your description of Dr. Smith's experiments struck me as almost line for line identical to Fabian Picard's, some of Fabian Picard's descriptions of insular cortex seizures.
Huh. Mm-hmm.
The phenomenology of insular cortex seizure.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you've seen any data on insular cortex activity specifically in these sorts of altered states.
Mm-hmm. And I certainly have not. Though, have you read Irreducible Mind? There's a beautiful book by Ed Kelly at the University of Virginia on various aspects of transcendent awareness and how it relates to activity in different parts of the brain. I don't know about the insular cortex per se, but I think that that would be a great place if you would like to actually look a little bit more at some of the research that he has collected out there. And I'm, of course, happy to continue conversing with you and tell you what I can find about insular cortex as well. But thank you. Yes?
Has anybody looked at what's going on in the heart when the brain is quieting down during a transcendental?
What is happening in the heart in terms of heart activity, like your cardiac rhythm and things like that?
Everything like heart rate variability
And I don't know that type of research. I certainly know research on energy healing and the fact that heart rate variability actually is improved with Reiki and energy healing in patients that have had heart attacks. But I don't know about transcendent experiences per se.
Well, I'm wondering specifically because if the brain is quieting down in these transcendental around the heart.
Yeah. And it's an interesting question. I mean, when I also talked about my energy that I experienced in my heart during my own mystical experience, I felt that it wasn't the physical heart per se. It was something else that was much vaster than that was energetic. And that's what made me question my materialist worldview, that maybe I was thinking too narrowly and thinking that it was just tied to my heart. Not to say that it might not affect my physical heart as well.
That could be interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you. Yes.
No direct experience or transmission occurred with you. I'm curious how common that was. I mean, how many people you were with? Were you the only one? Were there others?
There were others, and in fact, I mean, if I were giving a talk at another conference, I would share one about another neurobiologist that had happened to later, and basically, for him, it didn't happen during the day, but it happened in his sleep at the middle of the night, and in his case, he had this energy bolt, like, go straight up his spine, out the top of his head, light, and he ended up outside of his body, watching his body from above. So, yes, I mean, it's amazing how many people it's happened to in my own tradition, but I think probably in other traditions as well. And I should also say Dean Radin, some of you might know him, he's at the Institute of Noetic Science, has tried to study this energy like transmission process. And he said he had an interesting experience when he asked various teachers from different transmission traditions if they would be willing to come into the laboratory with people so he could study it. And he said at first they said yes, and then one by one they began to say no, because I think they felt, this is what he thought, that their ego was not controlling the process. It was something much higher than that. And they didn't feel that they could actually like make it happen on demand. And so because they felt it was something much more than them, they basically said, no, I don't really want to be doing this. So I thought that was an interesting thing that Dean Radin had to say about wanting to do some research and not having that happen.
The number, how many were there in that?
In that particular intensive program, there were like 500 people probably in that ballroom. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
How many others?
Yeah. And what I can do, though, is I can give you information, because I have a number of stories from other people.
Okay.
And I think it'd be fascinating to see the variations on those experiences. Thank you.